Good day everyone, Londononion here with another Gunslinger build fitting for the Apocalypse difficulty. To jump right into this build, we'll start off with the introduction of our secondary archetype, the Invader. The Invader is oriented toward use of decoys, elusiveness in combat, and overall survivability. The Gunslinger has no natural defenses outside of a predisposition for overcompensating offense. The Invader is naturally defensive, but strictly with avoidance and enemy misdirection. Taking a quick look at the perks, the only synergizing one is the Shark perk, which has a stacking damage buff of 7% for every evasion, or every second spent sprinting, and this stacks 5 times for 10 seconds. Critical chance is also increased by 1% for the same duration. All other perks are compensatory at best, but the true synergy comes from the practical use of both archetypes while traversing the biomes, and this I will speak more on toward the end of today's video. To begin this discussion, we'll transition to the build. So for the armor, I decided to go with the Loadout Mark I armor set. This will provide 180.8 units of armor and 95 units of encumbrance. As for the relic, this one comes down to preference, but I prefer to use the Ripened Heart for its efficiency. The shards I attach are ammo pickups, ranged critical chance or critical damage, and armor effectiveness. With my shard levels, this will increase armor to 207.9 units. Moving on to the weapons, I favor the Bonesaw LMG with concussive shot and maximized momentum. Concussive shot is intended to be an answer for enemies that don't respect personal space, despite the weapon's onslaught. Momentum increases critical chance and critical damage by 3% following a critical hit, and this stacks 10 times. When maximized, critical activation adds 2 stacks and increases the duration by 2 seconds. For the secondary, I employ the MP60 with corrosive rounds and maximized twisting wounds. Corrosive rounds increases ranged critical chance by 15% for 20 seconds while imbuing one with, well, corrosive rounds. Landed shots apply corroded for 450 damage over 10 seconds. Twisting wounds increases ranged damage by 20% to bleeding targets. When maximized, weak spot and critical hits inflict bleeding for 600 damage over 10 seconds. The melee weapon is a preferential option, but a fast handling and wide swinging weapon would be most logical in this Onion's opinion. The most important feature, however, is applying Shielded Strike, which grants a shield for 4% of one's max health for landed strikes. When maximized, charged melee damage is increased by a maximum of 25% based on the shield amount. With our basic constituents out of the way, we'll move on to the jewelry. Starting off with our amulet, or amulets in this case, I choose either the Difference Engine or the Energy Diverter. Both work similarly, but with a slight trade-off. For the Difference Engine, while a shield is active, one gains 1.5% base damage as lifesteal and an overall damage buff of 20%. Energy Diverter works similarly. It buffs damage by 15% and increases critical chance by 10% while a shield is active. For this build, I personally favor the Difference Engine for increased balance of firepower and a little bit of health maintenance. Moving on to the rings, the first ring I employ is the Rerouting Cable. For every 20 stamina units spent, one will gain 5% of max health as a shield for 5 seconds, maximizing at 50%, and resets after 5 seconds of inactivity. Synergizing with this, Generating Band grants 3% of health per second while a shield is active. Next, I employ the Sapphire Dreamstone, which decreases skill cooldowns by 3% for every critical hit, with a 2-second buffer between activations. For those of you raising an eyebrow at our weight encumbrance, I employ the Dull Steel Ring to bring encumbrance down to heavy as opposed to ultra. Next, we'll transition to the skills, traits, and a brief discussion on the build. So the skills are static on both sides of this pairing. For the Gunslinger, I employ Bulletstorm, and for the Invader, Void Cloak. Bulletstorm increases fire rate by 20% and reload speed by 50%. With the help of the prime perk, ammo reserves are infinite for 8 seconds, and weapons become immediately reloaded. Given our weapon profiles, a significant aspect about this skill is that one's weapon will automatically reload following enemy elimination. Void Cloak grants an automatic perfect dodge for a 60-second window. Each perfect dodge will reduce the duration by 33 to 100% depending on the evaded damage and will leave a decoy for 3 seconds. This would ideally prevent follow-up attacks as enemies will likely be distracted. As for the traits, I employ Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Bark Skin, Handling, Footwork, Recovery, and Shade Skin. To tie up how these two work together, the Gunslinger is an archetype of damage over time, weapon efficiency, and being the ranged infighter with a mysterious stockpile of ammo. The Invader's skills and perks imply a similar mode of combat. They are naturally elusive, but this is not to say that they are best employed far from a given battle. The Invader creates a counter-infighter of the Gunslinger, if you will. Now, the heavy armor is intended to compensate for the lack of bulwark stacks used in this build, but this onion would argue that it is also justified since a good amount of evasion will be performed with the Void Cloak. Not to mention, rerouting cable benefits from stamina use. Even though Void Cloak is a perfect saving grace, it won't always be around and has a cooldown time of 60 seconds. Our other ring selections act as contingencies for this. Rerouting cable and generating band work together, not only for health replenishment, but an extra layer of protection for when blunders take place. The loaded professional will likely be in close to mid-range of their enemies for maximum effectiveness, implying that they will constantly be on the move. The more active they are in combat, the more protection and health they will gain. Our weapon choices and mutators maximize the effect of Sapphire Dreamstone with frequent critical damage occurrences and minimize skill cooldowns. Whether one is attacking with their melee or their ranged weapons, either their skills will be regenerated faster or their shields and health. Outside of regeneration, the extra critical chance and damage generally increase the efficacy of the loaded professional with less time in combat per target. Regarding the application of my mods, I initially thought to equip corrosive rounds to the Bonesaw, and this is perhaps a superior option, but unfortunately, the weapon lacks any staggering capability, so any moderately tough enemy could simply march through fire. Additionally, I prefer to not treat the MP60 as a primary weapon, as the economy is a bit lower and won't last as long as the Bonesaw with regular use. Regardless, the MP60 has a relatively seamless reload and is not subject to overheating. Since we aren't using any rings or mutators for managing heat accumulation, I won't take this as much of a loss to overall damage. Paying attention to the heat meter may take some getting used to. This build, after all, is not necessarily intended to be a critical-based build, but a build with a strong critical edge. I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die, and sometimes this means that balance works over specialization. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses, based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.